Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Leadership Caffeine podcast. My very special guest today is Whitney Johnson. Whitney is an expert in personal disruption, and as she describes it in the opening of her fabulous podcast, she thinks, writes, speaks, and lives all things disruption. Whitney, it's great to have you here.
Oh, thank you, Art. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is our first chance to connect, although I feel like I know you. I've been listening to your podcast in the gym as I'm on the treadmill for quite a while now. So it's much better to have that interaction opportunity. But thanks for all of the great work you share through those interviews.
Oh, thank you. And it's fun to hear that these interviews are helpful as you're exercising and motivating you.
So I have to ask the obvious question: what is personal disruption? Because for example, we had house guests with toddlers around last week, and in my mind, there was a lot of personal disruption going on in our lives. I think you're on a completely different track. So what does that mean to you, and what should it mean to our listeners?
Well, I think that's certainly one very important definition of toddlers running around the house. From a term of art perspective, it is disruptive innovation is a term that was coined by Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School. And at its simplest, it's a silly little thing that takes over the world like the telephone did to the telegraph and the automobile did to the horse and buggy, and more recently, Uber's done to cabs. And personal disruption then is how you take all of these ideas and make them meaningful to you. And that was one of my big insights when I was working with Clayton, is that the theory wasn't just about products, it was about people. And you start at the bottom of a ladder, you climb to the top, and then you jump to the bottom of a new ladder, like the children's game Chutes and Ladders. And anybody who's listening, all your listeners, they'll be saying, yeah, I get that. Like, college, high school, college, my first job, my second job, I started at the bottom, I climbed to the top, and then I jumped. So that's personal disruption, taking those ideas that we apply to products and services and applying it to us as individuals.
Well, and you've certainly lived this in your life, right? What a fascinating background. So why did you decide? You at one point in time were one of the most successful, renowned investment analysts, and I forget the exact term that you used, but in the financial community, I believe you were on a first name basis with one of the world's richest people, Carlos Slim. If I read that in your biography, and you decided to just change it all. You decided to come back down that ladder. Tell us about that adventure.
Yeah, so it's so interesting. You're right. I mean, I think that's why I've loved these ideas, this theory so much, is because it helps explain my lived experience. But the example that you're talking about specifically is I had gone to work on Wall Street. I started as a secretary. I worked my way up and became an investment banker. And then I got disrupted. I moved into equity research, and equity research is where you analyze stocks, you build a financial model, you put a buy and sell on it. And it turns out I was really good at it. I was good at stock picking and spotting momentum. And I had been doing this for about 8 years. And in retrospect, I was at the top of my SCurve of learning, and I had gone to my boss and I said, I want to try something new. And he said, well, we really like you right where you are. And I had now read the Innovator's Dilemma, had this kernel of an idea that this theory of disruption wasn't just about products. And so within a year, I quit my job. I disrupted myself to become an entrepreneur. So that is how it all started. And this was back in like 2005. So 14 years ago now.
So what runs through your mind? You're at the top of your game. In essence, you can be playing to your strengths, right? You're really great at something. I suspect from knowing the industry and having many colleagues, the financial component wasn't poor. So it was probably very good. What's the driving force behind making that radical shift?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And what I would say is I think whenever you do something like this, when you're at the top of an S-curve and you make the decision to jump, there's always this confluence of factors. And I think, if I look at it for me, and then if we universalize it, you get to the top of an S-curve, you start to get a little bit bored. You've got this dopamine that you were enjoying as you were moving up the S-curve, but because you're no longer learning, that growth is starting to slow. You're not getting that momentum. And so this, what looks like and feels like a plateau, at least in the near term, can very quickly become a precipice. And so there's some element where you feel like, you know what, I've got this dilemma now. Like I can try to stay here, but if I do, my value is going to erode. I'm going to get bored and I might get disrupted. Or I can choose to jump and I can disrupt myself. I mean, that's what it is in its essence. Were there other things going on? Yes, of course. I was probably a little bit burned out. We had young children. I think I may have hit a little bit of a glass ceiling. But I think, fundamentally that there was this idea of, if I don't do this new thing, I'm going to die inside a little bit. And I think that's what happens with disruption is we have this sense that we need to do, in order to move forward, we're going to have to take a step back. And I think that is at its essence what was happening for me. And I think what happens for most of us when we make those decisions that look very counterintuitive and people are thinking, you lost your mind. We know that in order for us to move forward, we're going to have to take a step back, at least in the near term.
It's just such a powerful way to say it. And as you're describing that, I'm thinking back to my own experiences. I once left a job in a company I loved at the point in time when I had, achieved the height of what at least I thought I was going to achieve in my mid-30s. And my mother, who was with us at the time, asked, "Why are you doing that? They like you there." Exactly. And she could never wrap her arms or her brain around why the fact that I felt like if I stayed there any longer, I was going to atrophy. And it was just, it wasn't killing me physically, but it was really bothering me mentally and motivationally. So, I had never thought about it in your wonderfully eloquent perspective before. So thanks for the self-help here. You're helping me come to grips with.
You're welcome. And you know what I think is interesting about that, what you just said, is that I think, there's, a couple of years ago, I had Allison Levine on my podcast, who's climbed like 7 different summits. And one of the things she talked about is that, when you get to an altitude above 26,000 feet, like you're so high up, your brain and body start to die, like you're going to die. But I think that when you get to the top of an SCurve, if you stay there too long, your brain and your body will literally start to die. And so I think for you, like you said, well, I wasn't going to die. Well, no, not immediately,
right.
But there was some sense that there was an imperative there. And I think that that's one of the important things for us. And that's why I think sometimes we get to the top of an SCurve and we're not willing to jump for whatever reason. And I do believe, this is my hypothesis, completely unproven, but I think it's pretty true, is that's why we sometimes lose our jobs, is because we know we're at the top of a curve, or we know it's the wrong curve and we won't jump. We just won't. And so the universe pushes us off because we know that.
Is that fascinating?
Isn't that
Please do the research on that. Let's prove that hypothesis out. I agree with you. Yeah, what a fascinating initiative. So we're connecting now, and I'm showing, for those of you listening, the cover of Whitney's book, fabulous book, Disrupt Yourself, Master Relentless Change, and Speed Up Your Learning Curve. And we're talking just shortly after the release of the latest edition, where you've got a new introduction in the book. So who's this book for? Because when I first heard it, when it was out a couple of years ago, I thought it was for kind of the career reinventor. And you go pretty quickly out of your way in that new introduction to say, yes, maybe, but it's for more people. So tell us, who's this book for?
Yeah. So as you now know, because you read the introduction, but I remember when the book first came out and the Boston Globe was like, this is the "What color is your parachute for the entrepreneurial generation?"
But that's high praise.
I was like, yes. And then I was like, oh no, because I found that, one of the things, if you look at it, there's a very practical reason of this, is like, if the only people that are going to read this who are people who are leaving their jobs, then no corporation ever is going to want you to come talk to their people, because they're going to be like, well, if she comes in, all my high performers are going to leave.
You're right.
And it is true. I remember a couple of years ago, someone came up to me and said, I'm at this company because I read your book, because I left my other company. So it does happen. But what I wanted to as I started to process all this, because before that it was more sort of intuitive and subconscious, I was like, wait a second, no. What I want to make the point of is that if you as an organization are going to be a high growth organization, you need high growth individuals. And the only way that you become a high growth individual is if you know how to grow, you know how to learn, leap, and repeat, you know how to disrupt yourself. And this mechanism, this 7-point framework of personal disruption, is the mechanism by which you become a high growth individual. So yes, you can use it as a career changer, but if you're interested in building a high growth organization, here's your playbook for helping your people be high growth individuals. And so I needed to reframe that so that people could understand that it does apply across the spectrum, whether you're inside of an organization or outside of that organization.
I find your conundrum fascinating. That's a really good problem that you had with respect to the reception to your book and its applicability. So, but it makes sense. You mentioned the term, the focus is on high growth individuals. So what is a high growth individual? I want to be one of those.
Yeah, well, you already are. But I think the way I think about a high growth individual is it's a person who basically says, okay, how am I going to be better tomorrow than I was today? And I think, again, this goes to sort of a biological imperative that we have. If we're not growing, we're dying. If we're not growing, we're stagnating. And so the question is how do we stagnate less and grow more? Mm-hmm. And most of us, as I said earlier, high school, college, first job, second job, we know how to move up an SCurve and then jump to the bottom of a new one. And we do it instinctively. But a high growth individual is someone who understands the process by which you can do it so that you're systematizing it, you're effective. It's like you're automating the process, right? Mm-hmm. And when you can automate that process, you can do it more consistently and do it more quickly and more rapidly. And so that's what I mean when I say a high growth individual is someone who knows how to get better faster.
So I'm kind of putting on my manager's hat for a second and, thinking about just about every team I've ever had. And some people were high performers and loved the growth and loved the challenge. And others were pretty content to be role players and maybe never fit that description of high growth, or at least they were in a narrower description. So I'm not even sure what my question is, other than that I'm not sure that everybody that we can come across can be turned into a high growth individual or is one.
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. And if I can unpack it for a second,
sure.
Because sometimes people ask me a question that's somewhat similar is like, well, what do I do if I've got a person who's in this role and they don't want to jump to a new role? Like, does that mean they're not a high growth individual? Does that mean they're not a high performer? And one of the ways I think about it is that, whenever you're on an SCurve, you can be in the low end of the SCurve, you can be in the sweet spot where you're in the groove and everything's working and your neurons are firing, or you can be at the high end where you're starting to stagnate. You need to jump to the bottom of a new SCurve. And so you look at it and you go, well, on average, you could be in this role in this project for 3 or 4 years. And then you sort of learn and then you leap and repeat. The question always comes down to is, okay, let's use time and role as a starting point. But the only question that actually ever matters is this person growing and therefore helping your organization grow, or are they stagnating? And, yesterday I was talking to one of my colleagues who does a lot of work with me, and she was quoting Meg Ryan in the film, You've Got Mail. And she said, I live a very small life. It's valuable, but it's small. And I think one of the important things here is that if a person is in a role, they're contributing, they're enjoying it, they're not stagnating, then they're a high performer. The scope of what they do might be different, but they're still contributing. And so I actually, again, have this belief hypothesis that there is no such thing as a high potential. I think we're all high potentials. The question is, do we get people on the right SCurve and give them the tools they need to have momentum? Because when you're in the sweet spot, everybody's a high performer. When you're in the sweet spot, everybody's a high potential. So it's an interesting question, but to the earlier question, I think that you can be a high performer and not necessarily be jumping SCurves all the time.
How do we help find that right SCurve? And I suppose my conversation, I recently interviewed Julie Winkle-Giulioni, who I think wonderful things about her great book, Help Them Grow or Watch Them Go. Yeah. And that's kind of the essence of their career coaching work that they're doing is how do you help that individual find that right SCurve?
Yeah. So one of the things that I do when I'm thinking about this, so if we come back to the theory of disruption, what do we know? Well, when we're pursuing a disruptive course, our odds of success are 6 times higher, but that's 6% to 36%.
Wow!
So there's still a 64% chance it's not the right curve. So then the question is, well, how do you know when you're on a brand new curve if it's the right curve or not? Now that's with products that may not, be a complete analog for people, but here are 4 questions that I think can be really helpful as you're trying to suss that out. One is, are you playing where no one else is playing, which goes to the first accelerant of personal disruption, meaning, are you trying to do work that no one else is trying to do? Are you taking on market risk rather than competitive risk? And at very simplest, like when you take a new job, is there someone else in the company who thinks it's their job to do that? Because things have morphed over time. Now you're taking on competitive risk. There is going to be a turf war. There will be a skirmish. It's pretty hard to be super effective moving balloon.
Hard to win in that setting.
It's hard to win, and you might win, but you're going to be bloodied in the process. So are you playing where no one else is playing? There's lots of different implications for that, but we'll start there. The second is okay, so you've taken on this role. You've figured out that you are the only person that has been hired to do this particular job. Now are you playing to your distinctive strengths? And the challenge with that one is that oftentimes we overvalue what we're not and we undervalue what we are, which means that we put on our resume the things that we do well, not what we do best. And so we sometimes get into the wrong roles. And so you want to but second of all, be like, what do I actually do well? What are my actual superpowers? Like, I'm a good stock picker. Right. I'm a good model builder of good financial model builder. But I discovered after 6 to 7 years that what I'm really good at is not spotting momentum in stocks, but spotting it in people. And so I needed to figure out how was I going to use that strength and play where no one else was playing.
Did you have help figuring that out? My hypothesis is that we don't see our strengths or our superpowers, if I can use that kind of cliched term, as well as others see them.
We don't. We absolutely not. 100%. It just like our weaknesses we have blind spots around our weaknesses. We have blind spots around our strengths. Absolutely. And the struggle with that is oftentimes when I say to you, Art, you're really good at this. There's a piece of you that wants to reject it because it's so easy for you. You don't value it.
Right.
You're like, you think I'm good? Oh,
I guess, yeah. It's like, that's easy for, right.
Or why didn't you compliment me on this other thing? Like, I remember people being like, you're really good with people. And I felt like at some level they were hurling that at me like an epithet. Like, cause I was like, well, so what? Like, yeah, I am good with people. I wanted them to be like, you're great at building financial models, because that was harder for me. Like, I was good at it, but I had to work really hard at it. So part of the challenge for you as a manager is, once you identify the things that people are good at, is to actually persuade them that thing that they're good at is valuable. And then the secret is to give them a really hard stretch assignment that is going to push them hard, but it leverages that thing.
Well, and it helps them prove it to themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I may share an anecdote here, I'm probably breaking all podcasting protocols.
Oh, please.
Telling a story about myself.
Disrupt it.
A number of years ago, I'm an SVP of a software company. We're growing tremendously. The strategy is working. The company is doubling in size. It's just a tremendous environment. My boss, the CEO, comes up to me and says, Art, you've got your superpower all wrong. And I kind of looked at him and said, well, great, Dale. I suppose, I'm pretty well tuned into myself, but what do you think it is? He goes, you think your superpowers are about strategy and, driving change in organizations. You're good at that, but what you're really great at is helping individuals do things they never thought possible. That was the single best thing I stopped me in my tracks. I've been thinking about it for 5 years. I never actually thought about it that way at all. And by the way, I don't know if that's a superpower of mine or if I'm particularly good. That was just one person's perspective.
But how did you feel when he said it?
I think my brain froze for a second. And then I sort of had this, darn, that kind of explains who I am and who I want to be in this world. It was one of the more profound things anybody ever said to me. So I don't know that will happen to everyone, but I think that's what you were getting at.
Yep.
That maybe somebody will have that observation that will help you recognize that. Be open.
Absolutely. And one of the ways you can figure that out, Art, is to listen to compliments that you get. Like, just when you get a compliment, instead of like dismissing it immediately, like Teflon, like start writing it down, and those are going to give you those clues to what they are. The other 2 questions that you can ask, just really quickly to finish to close the loop on that question you asked me about right curve, wrong curve, is, are you playing to your strengths? Are you playing where no one else is playing? The third question you want to ask yourself is it hard but not debilitating? So, if you wake up every day and you're like, this is really hard, but I feel really alive, then growth is probably on its way. But if you find that you're feeling kind of weak, you're feeling debilitated, you might even be getting sick, then those are typically symptoms of a flatlining curve. And then the fourth question is an obvious one, is, are you just gaining momentum? Like, are you getting traction in whatever it is you're trying to do? And if the answers to those four questions are no, strengths, no one else is, hard but not debilitating, and gaining momentum, if it's all no, then it's probably not the right SCurve. And so those are, then you need to jump to a new one. But the good news is that no SCurve is actually ever wasted. There's lots of really good lessons
that accrue through that. Yeah. Those four questions are fabulous, and kudos to you for as much try as I might to derail and interrupt and interject. You stuck to those, and those were worth twice the price of admission here.
You asked me that question, I was going to answer it.
You did beautifully. All right, so here's a concept I want to talk about as it relates to jumping SCurves, and the word that comes to mind to me is terror.
Yes, that's a good word.
When you think about it, and if anyone who has done it knows that you leave a lot of professional equity behind. When you jumped out of the financial services marketplace and decided to become an entrepreneur, suddenly being on the A list and everyone on the planet being willing to take your call, or at least anyone who knew what they were doing, to, I'm Whitney Johnson, an entrepreneur, and you didn't have that cachet because you're somewhere else. It's very different. I've kind of lived it as well, and a few others I've been around. And terror, I think, is the apt word.
I agree completely. I mean, there is absolute, and I think there's a little bit, it's almost, the ignorance is a little bit of bliss. I think if I knew exactly what it would have meant, I don't know if I would have been able to do it. Because there's this moment, and if you think about it, it really is free fall. Like there's this moment of free fall where you lose your identity. I mean, you just said it really well. I couldn't say Whitney Johnson, Merrill Lynch. It was just right. Whitney Johnson. And to a lot of people, they're like, I don't care. Like, they talked to me because it was Merrill Lynch. And that was also really an interesting thing. But so here's what I would say to you. If you get to the point where you're at the top of an SCurve and you're like, I know I need to jump, but you're afraid, one of the ways that you can motivate yourself is, number one, is remember this theory of disruption. You play where no one else is playing. Your odds of success are 6 times higher. The other thing that's really helpful for me is you make it scarier not to change. So if you look at Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, the loss aversion theory, we're 2.2 times more motivated by what we lose than by what we gain. So if we're at the top of the SCurve and we're trying to motivate ourselves by saying, well, if I jump, then this is going to happen and all these awesome things are going to happen, that's actually not very motivating, because we can't quite picture it. But if we say to ourselves, okay, what bad things are going to happen to me if I don't jump? Like, I might get bored, and then I'm going to start to underperform, and then I'm going to get fired. Like, you can play.
Humiliating and humbling.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That's actually motivating for you, because there is no such thing as standing still. And if you're bored out of your mind, you will start to underperform. And so one of the ways that you can help yourself when you're dealing with the terror of doing something new is just start to say, well, what bad thing will happen to me? How do I make it scarier not to change? And you can bookmark or bound that decision in what good things will happen and what bad things will happen. It will start to give you the energy and momentum that you need to do something differently when you look at the good and the bad.
Fascinating way to look at it. So I'm thinking of your interview with Beth Comstock, and we chatted a little bit about that.
Yes.
She had referenced in her career that at some point she made a move that, to the outside observer, was a step down in prestige. And in her own admission, it wasn't much of a change in compensation, yet it's something that she had to do. And it ultimately led to an entire new set of SCurves for her and her great career at GE. And all I could think about was, my emerging theory of hop, skip, and jump. So maybe sometimes we have to do a hop, skip, and a jump before we get to that right SCurve.
Oh, I think that's right. I love how you said that. And we can obviously include, I'm acting like I'm interviewing you. You might want to include in the show notes that episode so people can listen to this story.
I will indeed. I will indeed.
But this idea of hop, skip, and jump, you actually just reminded me of two things. One is that we interviewed for the podcast not too long ago, Sarah Green Carmichael. She'd been an editor at Harvard Business Review for about 10 years. She jumps to go to Barron's, and we interviewed her, top of the curve, bottom of the curve, but not too long after interviewing her, she had moved to Bloomberg. And, so I think that sometimes this idea of hop, skip, and a jump and a jump is like basically.
That's a different theory, by the way. The hop.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the rebound boyfriend. It's like the rebound curve.
Right.
Like sometimes you've got to jump to a new curve because it's time to jump, but you're not going to quite get the curve right. So you're temporarily there because, again, no SCurve is ever wasted. It might not be the right curve, but you jump, you learn some things, you kind of flex that muscle of learning how to disrupt yourself, and then you jump to a new curve. So when you said that hop, skip, and a jump, that's what came to my mind, is sort of jump to a new one and then jump to the next one.
I haven't figured out how to codify that or back it with research, but I think there's something to it. And part of it is that I lived it. When I left that job that I loved that my mother didn't understand.
Oh, yeah. In your 30s. Uh-huh.
Yeah. I went to a job that I knew by noon on the first day was a horrible mistake.
The first day you knew?
Oh, by noon, by lunch. I knew it was a mistake.
What did you do?
I spent 18 months learning, and it took me that long to unwind. And you know what? It opened a door to the greatest opportunity of my life in terms of professional opportunities. I mean, what happened in the next decade after that was remarkable. And I wouldn't have made it unless I did the hop and the skip there.
Okay, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So what did you do? So it's the wrong SCurve, right? You're there. Yeah. How did you motivate yourself during that 18 months? How did you motivate yourself? Because I think that's a really valuable insight for your listeners of knowing, it's the wrong place, but for whatever reason, you can't jump. You've got to stay there for a while. You've got to bide your time. But you said that it then opened the door to this amazing opportunity. What did you do to motivate yourself during that interregnum, if you will?
Yeah, I'm having a little post-traumatic stress just thinking.
So it was hard. It was hard.
I say the long and short of it is that I was surrounded by some of the smartest people I've ever encountered in my life. And it happened to be the most toxic environment I've ever been around.
Okay.
But the people were brilliant. So I made a personal commitment to myself to learn as much as I could from these brilliant individuals in an area that I had little understanding and little expertise in, and to soak it up and try to enjoy the experience, because I couldn't go back to where I had come from. They would have welcomed me back, by the way, but I couldn't do it.
But you knew you couldn't. Yeah.
Yeah, I just couldn't do it. So I had to keep moving. And there were certainly some low points and low spots, but oh my gosh, it was the richest 18 months of learning I maybe have ever had in a professional setting.
Interesting. So you know what? When you just said that, in some ways it was a failure, right? In terms of the job choice, but that failure became this tool of creation for you, of probably lots of self-reflection. What am I going to learn? What am I going to do? And then you became this person in the process of this difficult situation that then was able to go out and do, like you said, the really fertile period of your career. Very cool.
It was cool. I did learn, by the way, and I think I can use this term. I really sucked at culture assessment, because that's where I whiffed in this new job. I was so enamored by the talents and the pedigrees and the growth and the opportunity to mix with these individuals that I completely missed the culture in the interviewing process. So that was a good lesson too.
Wait, I want to push back. Can I push back? Is that okay? Sure. I don't know that you were bad at the culture assessment. I think sometimes we just want something. And we know it, but you probably knew that it wasn't a good culture. I think sometimes there's just something we want. I just want it. And so we ignore everything else. And because, like you said, you were drawn to all these shiny objects. I don't know, something to reflect on, because I've thought about that in my own life. There have been things where I've in retrospect, all the signs were there. It was obvious that I should not do it, but I just didn't care because I wanted that thing.
Right. Cool. Okay. Well, I will think about it. By the way, you're helping with a lot of counseling and self-reflection today. So
I can't help. I'm sorry. I can't help it. My coaching, it just comes out. I can't help it.
So, with respect to this environment, imagine that we've suddenly got this environment. We're doing things right. We're asking and getting good answers to those 4 questions, and high growth individuals all around us.
Yeah.
Are we pitting these people in kind of competition against each other? Or are they competing really against themselves? And you speak to that in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's always going to be some competition against each other. Because we're humans and we're just super fallible.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I think that's part of where we, to the extent that we're the boss or to the extent that we're up here, we can foment that competition or we can diminish it. I'm thinking of a story, and I think I told it in Build an A-Team, so probably not in Disrupt Yourself, but there was a woman by the name of Helen Jane Hearn, and her boss was named Mary Gail Pizzamenti, and Mary Gail came in and Helen Jane's there, and then she's got this colleague, and they could have easily been pitted against each other, like kind of vying for the favor of the boss.
Sure.
And the boss pulled them together and said, okay, Helen Jane, you're really good at X. And Mary, I don't remember what her name was. It's not Mary, but let's call her Susan. Susan,
Okay.
You're really good at Y. I want the 2 of you to work together on this to make this project work. So she was very deliberate about articulating what each person's strengths are, what outcome she expected, and in order to achieve that outcome, they needed to work together. And so by creating an expectation where they had to work together, I think she diffused a lot of that situation where they would have been in competition with one another. So I do think oftentimes, probably subconsciously, but we like people to curry favor with us. We do. We like to feel important. And so it's easy to let people who work for us to try to want to get our attention. And so part of that's up to us to not create a situation where it's about making us feel good, but how to get people to work together and really believing that if each person can play where no one else is playing, have this opportunity to grow and develop, there will be other SCurves for them. It might not be on your team. It might not be your job, but because you believe in their growth fundamentally, if it's not on your team or your job, there will be somewhere else in the organization, somewhere outside of the organization, a vendor, et cetera, because they will know that you actually are in the end about building an A-team of people, regardless of the organization that they sit in. And then of course they become ambassadors for you because they're like, you're the best boss I've ever had. And that's quite the talent magnet.
Could you, that all of that is that's a book. That's a fabulous book. Is that all covered in the A-Team?
Yeah, a lot of it is. Yeah.
Good,
so the
good,
A-Team
good.
is all about like, how do you build a high performing team and how do you manage people at different points along the curve?
And I love that manager, by the way. What a fabulous example.
I know, right? Yeah, it was really impressive.
So there are a couple in your framework, embracing constraints. Constraints make us stronger. Clarify that, because sometimes we don't like constraints, right? They feel like they constrain us.
Yes, we bristle against them, right? Yes. We really do. And yet the thing that's really interesting about constraints is that if we look at the law of physics, that we actually need something to push against in order to make any sort of forward movement. Like it's just a law. And so when we're like moving along that S-curve, and like, well, if I had more time, if I had more money, if I had more, expertise, if I had buy-in from all my stakeholders, then I could be successful. Then I could move up the S-curve. But the reality is that we need the constraints. And one, quick example, I think for your listeners is that if you think about, there was a postmortem done of 200 failed startups, and they divided them into funded startups and unfunded startups. And they're like, well, why did they go out of business? And so they look at the funded startups, and these are the ones that they raised outside capital. They had all this money and they have this war chest. Well, the number one reason that those funded startups went out of business is they ran out of cash. Because they didn't have to be impatient for profits. They were just like, well, we'll just figure out how to grow it. But they didn't have to early on iterate to get to a business model that works. Interestingly, it was only the number 10 reason for the unfunded startups, the people who had to build their business on the cash that they had on hand. I think it's a really cautionary, important tale for any of us that are trying to become high growth individuals. If at any point we look around and we have no constraints, and we need to start imposing constraints, because those constraints are going to allow us to be successful. Simple example, right? If you're trying to write a book and you're like, I'll write a book someday.
Yeah.
You're never going to write a book. But if you like go out and be like, okay, publisher, I'm going to have this book to you by June 1st, 2020. Guess what?
Yeah.
You're going to write that book. That's a constraint, and it becomes a tool of creation.
And what I find that our small team here in my own practice, we live it all of the time. The constraints are driving innovation. They're driving us to be creative. They're driving us to find different ways to do things that, Absolutely. Of course, in a corporate life where I didn't have those constraints, I would have tackled in a very different way, usually by spending a lot more money.
Right. Exactly. And you see it all the time, you know, when you have those anything that you've done that's actually really meaningful, there were some pretty significant
no doubt about it. Yeah, no doubt. So I love the stepping back to grow, and we talked about that a little bit, but and I think your words, it's a carefully cultivated step back that can be a slingshot to high growth futures.
Yeah.
A lot of people struggle to actually internalize that or even be accepting of that. And I hear that all the time from individuals that want to do something different in their career,
right.
But they have to keep making the same money, and they need the same title, and they can't move, and so forth and so on. So suddenly they're throwing all of these constraints and not even willing to consider that slingshot opportunity there.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So I would say two things. One is that's where accelerant number 4 comes in this framework of battling our sense of entitlement, like to expect that we're going to be able to make the exact same amount of money to do a job that we've never done before in a geography that we want to, like we're giving up nothing, like the trade doesn't work, the transaction doesn't work. So one thing that we, what's the give, what's the get? Now, if you think about this idea of step back to grow, and I think a lot of your listeners, this will really appeal to how they're thinking about it. Like think about some graph paper and you're moving along, and let's say, y-axis is success and x-axis is time. Well, y-axis, let's say you're at 17 right now, and your trajectory in your career and your life is over 1, up 1, over 1, up 1. It's good, right?
Right.
You disrupt yourself. What you do is you say, okay, well, I'm at 17. I'm going to move down the y-axis to 12. And that 12 is going to mean a loss of stature, possibly a loss of money, etc. And people are going to think I've lost my mind. But the reason I'm doing that is because I believe that step down will mean over 1, up 3, over 1, up 3, over 1, up 3. So the step back becomes a slingshot. That's why we disrupt ourselves. We're making this calculated bet, one that we believe will hold us in good stead. But from a mathematical perspective, that's what it looks like.
What a beautiful way to envision it. So and sometimes we're going to fail at that, by the way, even though it was well calculated, we're going to fail.
We are.
How, and I know you talk about it, and Brene Brown talks about it wonderfully. Failure does breed that feeling of shame.
Oh, yeah, it does. And the thing that's so interesting, I think, Art, is that we all struggle with shame. Like there is not a person on this planet that does not struggle with that. Even the most, well-adjusted individual. So it's always going to be on this continuum. But what I would say is that whenever we fail, the question, let me back up. We all fail all the time. All the time. Like just now, I'm like talking and I'm knocking bottles over, like I'm failing, but am I fine with that? Yeah, because I don't feel my sense of self is not tied to that. My identity is not tied to, okay, I'm valuable because I didn't knock a bottle over, and I'm not valuable because I did. So one of the things that I think is really important is that when we're struggling with failure in any given situation, somehow it has triggered some shame. Somehow it has triggered our questioning our fundamental worthiness. And so one of the things that I really recommend that everybody do, including myself, is that we understand that it is shame that limits our ability to disrupt. It's not failure. And when we understand that it's the shame that's limiting that, then we can start to ask the question. Well, first of all, we can then do the inner work that we need to do to be able to deal with the shame and become more resilient.
Yeah, that's the hard part some people don't ever get to.
It's so hard, but we have to do it. Like if we're going to ever really become these high growth individuals, grown up individuals, we have to figure out how to deal with it. But I will tell you, just the other day, I had this situation where I had finished something. It did not go well. I immediately started to feel shame and like, oh, I'm terrible. This terrible sense of self, sense of self. I was like, okay, I can do that. And I can try to shore up, go to my husband and my children and be like, yes, really, Mom, you're awesome. It's totally counterproductive.
Right.
Because once I go to that place, I'm trying to prove that I'm valuable. And I don't ask the questions, which are, well, what didn't work? And what do I need to do differently so it works the next time? And so it's that shame that limits disruption. It's that shame that limits our ability to grow faster. So again, bottom line here, if you're struggling with shame, because you are, then just do the work. Do the work that you need to do. If you need to, go to a therapist. There's so many amazing podcasts, but do the work that you feel less shame this year than you did last year.
If you don't, you're limiting yourself. Absolutely. By the way, you hit on 2 of my 3 W's, my favorite questions in the world. I use them all of the time.
Oh, what are they?
What didn't and what do I need to do differently? And I change those a little bit depending upon the audience, but those 3 questions are with me every single day of my life.
So say them again.
What worked, what didn't, and what do I or we need to do differently?
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
So powerful, so simple, easy to remember.
Yeah, exactly. And can I just add one other thing?
Yes, you can.
I've been thinking about that a lot with my team, actually, and trying to make sure I don't give hand shame to my team. So when something doesn't work and I feel frustrated, is like to do exactly what you said. What worked, what didn't, what do we need to do differently, and make it about the system. Like what in the system broke down in this instance. So I'm not, because that's the challenge, right? As a parent, as an employer, is to make sure that we're not handing shame to the people.
Now you're channeling my inner Deming, because it is almost always the system when it's breaking down in the working environment. Of course, if we're at the top of the chain, we're responsible for creating the right system. So if that employee is feeling shame and it's the system, we own fixing that system.
Yeah, it's a good lesson. It's one that I'm just starting to key into. Thank you for reinforcing it.
Pure shameless question. What's it like to work with Clayton Christensen? By the way, don't you hate that? Because I really am fascinated on what it's like to work with Whitney Johnson, but Clayton is one of my heroes as well.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you. So he is so smart, so thoughtful, so humble, and really a good man. So it was an honor that I got to work with him basically, very, very closely for about 7 years. So
what a wonderful experience.
Yeah.
As sidebar, I read 2 of his books while my wife and I were sailing through the South Pacific. I think I read Jobs to Be Done and How Will You Measure Your Life, I believe. I'm not sure if I massacred that title, but those 2 books during that trip, and it really kind of defined the trip for me.
Wow, that's so cool. So they were kind of like not the soundtrack, but the book track of your trip.
Absolutely. So, what's the SCurve that you might be contemplating jumping to in your world?
Such a good question. So I think right now, I think the way I'm thinking about my SCurve right now is I've been kind of at the low end of the SCurve from a business standpoint. And so right now I'm trying to figure out, and I hope moving into the sweet spot of that SCurve of like, how do you build a business? So like, you've got ideas and you've written a book and, I go and speak about those ideas and I do some coaching, but how do you build a business where you've got people who work with you? We're just now starting this coaching certification around build an A-team and disrupt yourself. But how do you do that? How do you turn these ideas into products? How do you make it so that it's something that isn't dependent solely on you and can, I'm going to use the word that just came to my mind because I need to do that. How do you bless more people's lives? Like, how do you help them see this framework, this idea for like, okay, if I understand how I grow, then that's going to mean that when I'm at the low end and I'm feeling discouraged, I'll be like, oh, but this is normal. It's okay. I'm discouraged. I need to keep going. So that's the SCurve that I'm on right now, is like figuring out how do we build and scale a business. And as you well know, it's one thing to advise and counsel. It is another thing entirely to do.
Yes.
It's a good challenge.
So well said. The parallels we have are, although you're way ahead and way beyond where
Oh,
I'm, but I
that's
have
nice. Thank you.
similar challenges. And I've often remarked to my wife, probably in elements of feeling a little bit of shame here, is, I'm really good at growing corporations, and I'm not so great at growing my own practice here. This is a
Yeah,
lot harder.
of course it
Coming
is.
up, finding ways, and the term my Silicon Valley friends is, how do we scale this, right?
Right,
How do we make
right.
certain that it's not art that has to be speaking, running the workshop, delivering the course, running the coaching sessions, and
Yep.
it's both a challenge to figure out and exhilarating. So I hope you're exhilarated by it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's how you know, right? So you look at your work and you go, back to that question, right
Yeah,
curve,
right.
wrong curve. Like, am I playing where no one else is playing? Yep, enough. Am I playing to my strength? Yep, enough. Is it hard? Yep. Is it debilitating? No way. Is it super fun? Yes, right? Those are the questions. Are
Just
we gaining
fantastic.
momentum? Yes. And if you're not momentum, you tweak, but yeah, it's so great.
Good for you. So as I look to position your book with my clients in audiences, I can see those individuals that are really kind of struggling with next in their careers. And
Yep.
those were the people, and then you were quick to highlight in the new book, in the introduction, that it's also organizations.
Right.
I, I think it's incredibly valuable for both audiences. Any disagreement with that?
No, and here's what's interesting, Art, is when people, like, I don't know, about 6 or 9 months ago, people said to me, "Well, who's reading your book?" And I was
Hmm.
like, "Okay, who's interested in your work?" And I was like, "Well, people who are going through change and upheaval, that need to like disrupt their businesses." And then I started looking at who was actually paying us, like hiring us to
Right.
coach or consult. They were high growth organizations. They were
Interesting.
either like, growth stage companies that have $80 million in revenue, or like, billion-dollar companies, or even, Fortune 500 companies, but they were all focused on growth. And so I realized that maybe people sometimes want it when they're going through upheaval, but more often they need it and they don't realize they need it.
Hmm.
But
Right.
it's the growth ones that are like, okay, we are growing so fast and I need to make sure that my people can keep up. We need your help. And that's what typically
What a
happens.
fun place to be. What a
It
great
is
sweet
fun.
spot. And that's a wonderful way for me to think about how to position this great book and your great content. So I have to ask you my final question. And
Yes.
we'll see, you're the second person I will have asked this question to. And the first guy, I caught Mark Efron off guard on it. So it's my New York Times book review dinner party question. If you
Oh,
can have a dinner party with anybody from all of history, the great thinkers, the 3 or 4 people around there, who would it be and what's the conversation about?
oh. Um, One person I would definitely want to have dinner with is Benjamin Franklin, because
Oh, yes.
I read his biography a couple years ago. It was fascinating.
Did you
Loved it.
read was it the Isaacson version or
Yes.
yes,
It
yeah,
was
fabulous.
so
It's
good.
staggering, yeah. Then
Fantastic.
I jumped back and read his autobiography after reading Isaacson's
Yes.
biography.
Yep. Exactly. And then I read Ron Chernow's book on Hamilton. I was like, wow, what would it have been like to be around these people and the intellectual sparring that took place? So that would definitely be part of it. But um, I think I would also want to talk to some people that we don't know and we've never heard of,
Mhm.
and women in particular.
Mhm.
I think about a book I read a few years ago um, by Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and I think it was called The Midwife's Tale. I might
Mhm.
be not getting the right title, but where she had found this journal of a woman, or a diary of a woman from 300 years ago, who was a midwife, and then constructed this whole biography on that basis. And I think that it would be really interesting to have conversations with some people who lived these really interesting, in some ways small, but no less valuable lives. I think it would be fascinating to have a conversation with those individuals. And then probably, I think it would be really interesting. And now that you asked me this question, it'd be interesting to have a conversation with some of the people who lived around the time of Jesus. And what was that experience like? Like his mother, like, what was that like to be around this person who in so many ways was a prodigy, and just have that experience, since we're having this conversation in December of the year and my mind is on Christmas. But those are some of the people that I would want to
That is
talk to.
fascinating. I so want to join this dinner party. Can I at least be a spectator in the background, or
Well,
a leader or something?
I think since you issued the invitation, you're probably going to be the host, and you just let me curate who was going to come. But yeah, I think those are some people that come to mind. And of course, not modern day, it would be fun to have dinner with Brene Brown, because she's awesome.
Have you met her personally?
We've met, and
Okay.
she blurred my very first book, but I don't know her well, and I really appreciate how she shows up in the world.
It's just remarkable, Letty. But this has been a remarkable interview. I am so honored to have had you here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your insights and all of your great work. I know the audience will all be the beneficiaries. I think I'm the beneficiary on many levels, including some coaching and counseling along the way. So, Whitney, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Art, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Take care.